So, dear guest of honor, dear Professor Kühl, I'm very happy to welcome you here in the Schönfeld Hörsaal, dear TUD community, here in the Hörsaal as well as in the online stream. We do know that many people always join us online, and also today, I'm sure it's the case. So, who is not familiar with the fascination for our closest relative, the great ape? And in no other animal do we indeed recognize ourselves so well. And indeed, we do belong to the great ape family, whether we like it or not. It's a fact. And just to remind us, 98% of our genes are identical to those of chimpanzees. But kinship, as we also know, in many cases not necessarily means compassion. Homo sapiens is the only species among the great apes that is not threatened by extinction. We are working on it. And it is a matter of debate whether we can still succeed in protecting the great apes from ourselves. So human civilization and human willfulness are continued threats to our brothers and sisters, the great apes. Now today, we welcome Professor Dr. Hjalmar Kühl to our university, a scientist who has been in close contact with these members of our extended family for many, many years. He has been following great apes with an analytical eye and mind for many years. He conducts research into evolutionary and Anthropocene ecology and researches the coexistence of humans and animals. Behavioral flexibility and cultural diversification in the face of ecological and social challenges is indeed the focus of his research. And last year, we are very proud to report he was appointed Professor for Mammal Diversity at TUD's very own IHI in Zittau. Together, in second affiliation with our Faculty of Biology, here at TU Dresden Südvorstadt campus. At the same time, Professor Kühl became the head of the zoology department of the Senckenberg Museum of Natural History in its location in Görlitz. And all of you may know or may not know, its Senckenberg Museum is a valued member of the Leibniz Association. Professor Kühl joined us from a very prestigious institution, the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, and he also had been involved and hopefully continues to be involved with the German Center for Integrative Biodiversity Research, which is a trilateral institution between the University of Halle, Jena, and Leipzig. Hjalmar Kühl now brings his expertise to our university and indeed enriches the portfolio of our research on sustainability. At least we hope so, and that you do so in a sustainable manner. Leave your print. On behalf of the TUD community, therefore, I'm extremely pleased to welcome Professor Hjalmar Kühl to our university. Now, we have a special day today. The trains are on strike and other people are also on strike, and nevertheless we are having our lecture here. But we are very happy that we have an online community joining us, and I do know from Hjalmar Kühl that most of his family members who wanted to be here today will be online, and not only from various places in Germany, but as we were chatting about his first name, Hjalmar, I learned that parts of his family also reside in Iceland. And so I hear from him that we have guests from the Kühl family joining us from Iceland. So welcome to all of you, and you are welcome very much on our TUD campus if it's only virtual today. So we do know that outstanding scientific commitment is only possible if the scientist has a family that stands firmly with him and supports in all the respects that we need in the ups and downs of our profession. So I'm sure your family has been doing this very successfully, otherwise you wouldn't be sitting here. Now, this professorship is a very good example also for the importance of collaboration, and another example for our scientific ecosystem here, which is driven, as you all know, by the Dresden Concept Science and Innovation Campus, the Dresden Concept Alliance, and indeed the Senckenberg Museum as a Leibniz Institute is a very valued member of this alliance. Now, it's also a great pleasure for me that we bring one of our central scientific institutions, the IHI Zittau here, which resides at the heart of our TUD campus Lusatia, Campus Lausitz. And so I'm very happy that we bring you here for this inaugural lecture and to provide testimony for your close collaboration, ongoing collaboration with the Senckenberg Museum in Görlitz. I'm sure that is true. So it is also very good news for our students because Hjalmar Kühl will contribute, has been contributing possibly in the last semester to the Master of Science degree program, Organismic and Molecular Biodiversity. And it is indeed one of the crucial challenges that is often overlooked of our times, that biodiversity in times of climate crisis and other threats that are human-made are threatening a very important tool for the balance of our planet, which is biodiversity. And with this short introduction, I'm handing over to my colleague Thorsten Klaus, who is the director of the International Institute Zittau, to give his welcome and talk about the role of this professorship for the International Institute in Zittau. And then he will be handing on to Professor Carsten Wäsche from the Senckenberg Museum, who will give us more of a laudatio for Hjalmar Kühl, before we then turn over to our guest of honor himself. And as always, we have a Q&A after the lecture, and we hope you will have time to join us for a reception downstairs afterwards. So again, welcome very much, and I'm very excited and looking forward to learning from you about the great apes.
Magnificence, dear Hjalmar Kühl, dear guests, dear colleagues. When in 2013 the International Institute Zittau was integrated into the Dresden University of Technology as a central scientific unit, some of my colleagues mourned for the loss of our independence. But it's not only the opportunities of a university of excellence that were opened up to our small tri-national university experiment by this decision. Our institute was a collaborative university experiment. Our institute was a collaborative model right from the start. In the 19th, our Czech and Polish partner universities defined the course of our development, and the introduction of the Bologna system in the first decade of the 21st century was accomplished cooperatively with the University of Applied Science, Zittau Görlitz. Our new phase under the roof of our university, therefore, was more an update and enlargement of our partner networks than a loss. Our professorships and programs today are not only interlinked with the faculties of economics, environmental science, and biology, we also became the relay of TUD to several Leibniz institutes in Upper Lusatia. Joint appointments were introduced with the Leibniz Institute of Ecological, Urban and Regional Development, and most intensively with the Senckenberg Museum of Natural History in Görlitz. Senckenberg initiated the implementation of two English taught, highly international master programs that form the backbone of our study program today. Biodiversity and collection management, now relaunched as organismic and molecular biodiversity, and ecosystem service enjoy stable students' demand and are regularly evaluated very well. It's these two programs that transform our former Polish-Czech-German trinationality into a multitude of about 40 nationalities from our 4 continents and make our institute maybe the most international place in the middle of the metropolitan triangle Dresden, Wrocław, Prague. We owe the success to the great commitment of our colleagues of Senckenberg. Without the vision and persistence of Professor Zolander, this surely would never have come a reality. It was a stroke of luck for us that Senckenberg wanted to develop the Görlitz site into a teacher campus with the 3 heads of Senckenberg departments as jointly appointed professors, Professor Zolander, Professor Ansorge, and Professor Wäsche. Not only they contributed much more to the 2 programs that jointly appointed professors usually do. They involved their entire teams, premises, and the fantastic collections of Görlitz, creating a unique, truly cooperative study offer. A big thank at this point. In the past years, the first generation of the jointly appointed colleagues has retired, with one exception, Mr. Wäsche. Now introducing the second generation. Professor Hjalmar Kühl succeeds Professor Ansorge, and Professor Zolander's successor will be appointed very soon. These appointments ensure the continuity of the positive development at our institute. We are looking forward to integrating Professor Kühl and his team into our network. His move from the Max Planck Society in Leipzig to our university demonstrates the attractiveness of Upper Lusatia. His research focus, the great apes, rounds of the research areas. May not only the new building of the Senckenberg Society in Görlitz, but also our cooperation be and continue to be based on a solid, sustainable foundation. Welcome and thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear students, my very dear colleagues, dear Hjalmar, I have the pleasure to represent A, the Chair of Biodiversity of Plants at TU Dresden, and B, Senckenberg Museum for Natural History in Görlitz. And thus also, I am a member of the EAI Zittau. In Görlitz and Zittau, we do care a lot about nature. I mean, we are a natural history museum. We care about the diversity of life on Earth and the diversity of geological features on Earth. And one reason why we do that is that many of us feel that there's something changing rapidly and to a large extent. Biodiversity or geobiodiversity at the moment, and I guess all here in this room know that, is changing in unprecedented manner in terms of rapidity and also extent. What we experience at the moment is something that has not been experienced by any society of humans before. And you may know that the geologists are about, or already have agreed on, that we have a new geological era, which may be called the age of humans, the Anthropocene. The changes are vast, and it's absolutely clear, at least for me, that this will affect also humanity. We are changing the planet, and that will affect our life. Having said that, those who do research in these topics have to admit that there's, in fact, still very little that we know in detail. yeah, we know for some species, for example, the better researched ones like the more prominent primates, what happened to their distribution, to their populations, but we know a lot less about changes in their genomic constitution, their interactions, and also their behavior. More research is urgently needed, and this is where we finally arrive at Hjalmar. We are really, really happy to have a person here that is an absolutely well-known and outstanding researcher in his field. We heard already that Hjalmar devoted his life to the large monkeys that are our closest relatives, the apes. And Hjalmar contributed a lot of basic science on this particular group. I had happened to meet Hjalmar, I don't even know exactly when, but a couple of years ago, when you were still at IFA and also a member of IDIF, the Saxonian, also partly Saxonian Center of Scientific Excellence in Biodiversity Research. And ever since I know you, Hjalmar, I have to admit I was really impressed by your experience, your knowledge, actually your scientific rigor, and also your courage. You may want to hear that Hjalmar, being in Görlitz now at Senckenberg for some time, initiated together with Raphael Ernst, research in what was the dark heart of Africa, was retermed the green heart of Africa, to others of us known as the Democratic Republic of Congo, and that is not an easy region. So much about courage. And in short, I can assure you, we're looking forward to a talk by an excellent researcher. That's basic science, but those of us who do conservation will know that basic science alone won't do. Science alone will not save the planet. What we need is applications. And being a conservation biologist myself, I am also very impressed, and this is where we cooperated, that Hjalmar also is one of the leading experts in applied issues broadly related to wildlife in all sorts of aspects. Hjalmar certainly is one of the leading persons in Germany, Europe, possibly globally, looking at human-wildlife interactions. And we have to admit, and all of us who follow the press about wolves, for example, know there can also be conflicts. And Hjalmar addresses these things on a local, regional, and with this recent Africa-European comparison that was nicely published about a year ago, also international level, transcontinental levels. That really is deeply impressive, and not so many researchers, still far too few, are good in basic science and still venture into the applied field, at least if it comes to biodiversity research. But this is still research, and if we want research and conservation to take momentum, we also need to be able to communicate this to people. Yeah, there are students at a university. Students are, of course, key audience for us, but admittedly, there is a larger part of the science-relevant society that is not in science as such. You know, we need to talk to the broader community. And I want to end this very short laudatio here with a little story about an evening we had in Görlitz early July. There was a discussion about what is Senckenberg doing in the city, and we get a new building, and people on the streets were asking what we are doing in the building. So we came up with the idea to have an evening where we represent our research and Hjalmar give an evening to present his research. So a crowd gathered in one of our lecture halls in Görlitz. So there were people like the Senckenbergians, trained mammal biologists, all sorts of biologists, scientists, communication people, and the interested ordinary Görlitz citizens. And Hjalmar presented cross-cutting research, truly nicely published, very, very impressive. And although I'm not a monkey person, I got an idea that this is truly amazing science. And what struck me most was that this was presented in a manner that an ordinary botanist like me could understand this, and even more so, the ordinary citizen could understand this. We had a relatively, by Görlitz standards, vivid discussions, and most of the people asking questions were not from the science audience. So somehow, Hjalmar managed to deeply impress the scientists in the room and still somehow get the ordinary citizen hooked. They were listening, and some of them moved in very skeptical. I'm not commenting at our Görlitz population, and moved out quite happily. And this is where I want to end with. At that evening, I thought, there was not a single other person in the room that could have done such a thing. None of us would have been able to give this level of scientific excellence at the moment and still be able to communicate this to a broader audience. Hjalmar, that was really a major achievement. Congratulations once again on that evening we had quite some time ago. And this allows me now to conclude my laudatio. I can assure you, very dear audience, we're looking forward to an interesting talk, and don't worry, I'm sure everybody here will understand what Hjalmar is talking about. Hjalmar, stage is yours. Please do it again.
So does this work? Well, okay. This falls off here. Okay. So I would like to thank you very much, Professor Staudinger, Professor Klaus, and Carsten, for this introduction and the very kind words. So I realize now, after Carsten, what you said, the expectations are likely now very, very high. So we will see here. I would like to welcome you, all of you here in the lecture hall, and also all of you who are attending and watching here this lecture online. Okay, where's this here? So it's a bit noisy. So this is a typical sound you hear in a West African rainforest. I would like to take you to the trail of great apes onto a journey of our closest living relatives. You hear now some monkeys vocalizing in the background, you hear some cicadas, and that's very typical when you are in ape habitat. And so from this first experience, I would like to go back now to the year 2001. In 2001, I had just finished university, and I was thinking of what should come next. At that time, I was a reader of Spektrum der Wissenschaft. There's also the Scientific American. And this is a magazine that gives you a very broad overview of scientific topics you may have heard at university, but maybe you have not even heard about in physics, in chemistry, biology, medicine. So very interesting to read. Now I'm saying something that I would like to send particular to the students. Sometimes it is very important to pursue things and to be persistent. And this is what I did with the following. So in that issue, there was a nice article which really fascinated me about the culture of chimpanzees, die Kultur der Schimpansen. And it was written by two professors, Andy Whiten from St. Andrews, Scotland University, and from Professor Christoph Bösch. At that time, he was the director of the primatology department at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. And this article fascinated me for various reasons, and I decided to apply. And now this is the story: be persistent. Yeah, if you get a rejection, try a second time or a third time. This is what I did. And first I got offered a position as a field research assistant to habituate a group of chimpanzees in Ivory Coast, and then followed by a PhD. So at that time, it was not clear to me that this should basically be my career for the next 2 decades. I assume many of you have seen a cartoon like that. This is the human evolution from a chimp-like ancestor, now the quadrupedal walking to a bipedal walk in an upright position. And now there are various versions of that, like we sit now with a bent back in front of our computer, but this here has a different extension. And this shows that we are basically eradicating our own evolutionary roots. So we are killing our closest living relatives. And when I say this, then I do not mean people who do that physically, but it's also all the people who consume resources from great ape habitat, and that includes us, and I will come back later to that. So this drawing shows nicely the two ends of my work. So on one hand, studying great apes for understanding hominid evolution, including ourselves, and the other hand, contributing to conservation science. So we humans, I go now back for a moment to humans before I then return to great apes. We humans are characterized by very, very high intraspecific diversity and cultural diversity. An example are languages, 6,000 languages on the planet. Or it is the diversity of food, this just to name a few examples. But certainly, I mean, we can now study human culture and intraspecific variation. We could do that, but it's already very complex. But we can also go to some of the animals, which have a much simpler system, but nevertheless, they also have cultural diversity. And now I give you some examples before I come to the great apes, which are maybe not as complex, and you may not ever have thought of that. So when you think about migratory behavior in birds, for example, when they have traditional routes over which they migrate, or when you think about Drosophila, the fruit flies, in terms of their mating behavior. When you think about ranging behavior of dickhorn sheep, for example, or primates, I mean, they were already mentioned a few times, that they keep traditions once they are trained to feed on particular corn, for instance, in different colors, one with a bitter taste and the other one without a bitter taste, that even if the bitter taste is removed, that they stick to the color of the corn. And then feeding behavior in meerkats or in whales. These are just a few examples. But now going back to our closest living relatives, here the chimpanzees, I would like to show you 4 videos. This is very different behaviors, tool-using behaviors for the extraction of resources and also communication behavior. And so when you look at the lower right, you see, it should start now. What's happening? No. You see now a chimpanzee taking a stone, a big stone from a hollow tree, which they had put in before. They take it out, they vocalize, and they throw it back against the tree. So it is not clear what this behavior means. You have nut cracking on top, you have algae fishing left on top, and then you have termite fishing on the bottom left. So these are just a few of the behaviors that are found in chimpanzees. So there are many, many more, just to give you some examples. So before the article in Spektrum der Wissenschaft was published, there was an associated scientific publication in 1999, a very important and influential paper, Culture of Chimpanzees. And I've taken this chart here from that article, and it shows you in the background map of tropical Africa, and you see there 6 locations. 2 in West Africa and 4 in East Africa. And then you have a line, and each is associated with a chart. Now the charts are a bit complicated. The details do not matter. I mean, there are different icons in there, 39 in total, the maximum. Some are round, some are squared, colored, not colored. This all doesn't matter. What is important here is that they all look different. When you look at them, none equals another one, and that is important. And that means these different icons, they represent different behaviors. 39 behaviors, whether they are present or not, or which type of behavior. And this says that all of these populations, they have their own cultural repertoire, they have their own culture. So like we humans, also the chimpanzees, they have their own culture. And that can even differ between neighboring groups. At that time, it was very important, and it was a very, very convincing demonstration that chimpanzees and great apes have these cultures. But it was a description. It was not about the drivers, why this is emerging. It was just clear, this is there, but not why is it there. And so when I did my PhD at the Max Planck Institute, this question came to my mind again and again. What are the drivers of this intraspecific variation, of the diversification within that species? And over the course of the years, I thought more and more about that, and it was also clear that we could not continue with just these 6 populations. By now there are some more. And the problem is, when you think about what could be potential drivers, you can think about climate, you can think about some social factors, maybe about population factors, population density, and so on, habitat factors, environment, and so on. So we have quite a number. And then from a statistical point of view, it's impossible. So you cannot just take 6 data points and then you throw maybe 20 variables at that. It's not working. That's the problem. So you need a much, much larger sample size in order to tease apart the different hypotheses. And this is what we wanted to achieve, so we had to think about a new concept. So how to study chimpanzees, study the behavior and the diversity of our closest living relatives in a different way. So before, they were habituated to the presence of humans, which is also what I did when I started as a field assistant. And so then they are followed on a daily basis. You can follow them at close distance, a few meters, and you can make observations. But that was impossible because it's a long process, takes 5 years, yeah, and you cannot do that with, say, 50 or 100 communities. Impossible, yeah. And so we came then up with this Pan-African program, and I would like to tell you now a bit more about this. So the idea is to collect a lot of information about the diversity of a large number of populations. So I gave you the example of behavior diversity, which is on top, but it's also about other things, genetic diversity, microbiome diversity. When you think about physiological diversity, habitat diversity, the diversity of prey species, and so on. So really comprehensive collection of all of these populations. And this is a small animation, which I start now here, and which shows you of how this was done. So there is a large number of sites that is implemented across the range of chimpanzees.
His colleagues are observing around 40 chimpanzee populations in 14 African countries, also to find out how many of the animals are still alive.
So you heard something that you've heard already before, also to find out how many of them are still alive. Yeah? Because that is the problem when you want to study them. You want to study an almost intact population, and I come later to that. That was one of the problems we faced. Yeah? So you go to a place, you don't know whether you will find them, and if so, if you find them, can you still study them, or are they at a density that is too low? And obviously, this is nothing that a single researcher can do, yeah? And not even a department or a working group can do. For that, you have to establish a very, very large network of people who are very motivated also to emerge or submerge into different cultures. And there were many, many people involved in that. They dedicated a year or longer to this work. So with the support of this huge network of people, we could start data collection at 57 sites. So this was, say, the lower or the minimum we thought we need in addition to existing sites and information to come up with something where we could do at least some statistical analysis. Yeah? For sure, hundreds and hundreds of data points, always better, but that was considered the minimum. And so we could then finally complete the work at 39 sites. And now you may ask, why is that the case? The reason is that some of the sites where you have the crosses, chimpanzees were either already gone, yeah, they were at so low density that they could not be studied anymore. When you have maybe 2 or 3 individuals left, you cannot do that. In other cases, there were security issues and people had to leave the area. So we were successful with almost then 40 sites. And that gave us an enormous collection. I listed here some of the items we collected, both digital data and then a physical collection also. For instance, we had installed 1,200 camera traps across the range. We had then more than 500,000 of wildlife videos, more than 10,000 genetic samples, plant samples, and so on. It's really an enormous collection. And that helped us then to go back to this question on what are the drivers for the emergence of behavioral diversity, or in general, the intraspecific diversity of chimpanzees. And I would like to talk now about 2 of the projects. And so the point here is that because you have not just a single level of diversity, say if you want to study genetic diversity, but because there are so many, you have to integrate your data in some way. So now I've taken here now the example of 5 of these levels. We have behavioral diversity, we have genetic diversity, habitat diversity. Also, we said this already, I mean, human impact is important. There isn't a single population on Earth and probably not a single species on Earth that is not impacted by humans. And obviously also the landscape history. And I will start now integrating some of these. There are dozens and dozens of these layers, because inherently when you want to integrate this, it's spatial information, because you have all of these sites across the African continent. And this is a good way of combining this information. And the first question we could ask related to the emergence of behavioral diversity: is chimpanzee behavioral diversity higher in more variable or in more stable environments? So to give you an example, if I live in an environment that's very stable, has a lot of food, maybe I dedicate only a few hours per day to feeding, and the rest of the day I can do something else. So does this make me innovative? So I can invent something, some tools maybe, and then I'm more innovative. Or does that happen when I live in a very variable environment? So there is time of food scarcity, and I'm forced to do something in order to survive. And at first sight, I mean, it's impossible to answer that question. I mean, it can be both. Yeah? And so this is one of the examples where you need data so that you can tease apart hypotheses. But now the question is, what is a variable environment? On which time scale is that measured? And obviously, this is not easy. I mean, we can measure that on long time scales, on tens and hundreds of thousands of years, or we can do that also on short time scale. One of the measurements for the variability of the environment we came up with were forest refugia. So there's the hypothesis that during glaciation on the northern hemisphere, there was also a change in rainfall pattern in tropical Africa. The forest changed, extracted, expanded and contracted. And this is what you see here in this small map. The light green areas indicate the supposed forest refugia. I come back to that on the next slide. Just keep that in mind for now. This is a long time scale, so we talk about tens of thousands of years. Now, something on a shorter time scale is seasonal precipitation. So basically, something that happens every year. Yeah, you have a pattern every year. So I've taken here two examples. Guinea-Bissau, a dry area. You have a shorter rainy season, just a few months. And for most of the year, there is no rainfall at all. Or in Libreville, in Gabon, in Western Equatorial Africa, there is rainfall for 9 months in the year, and then during 3 months, there's almost no rainfall. That's the opposite. Yeah? So that is variation in seasonal rainfall pattern. And then another measure is obviously the savanna forest difference. When you just look at the vegetation and you see there is difference. So now back to this Pleistocene forest refugia, because they are very relevant, as you will also see later. These are in light green the Pleistocene refugia, forest refugia, and the different dots indicate the sites where we had studied chimpanzees, and the lines indicate the distance to the closest forest refugia. And so a colleague modeled the distribution of chimpanzees over 125,000 years based on paleoclimatic data. So it's animated here, and you see, now while the years pass by, you see how massively this is changing. Red indicates quite stable areas where chimpanzees were present throughout all of these 125,000 years. And the darker areas means that they also disappear. And you see that some of the areas in West Africa, Western Equatorial Africa, and then also in East Africa, that they match quite well to the Pleistocene refugia you see in the other map, which are based mainly on plant distribution and pollen analysis. So this is something, it's important. I mean, to understand this can happen on a very long time scale. So what we did is we now linked these measures of variability of the environment to the observations. We had selected 31 behaviors. I've shown to you 4 of the behaviors, so there are more. We used 31 behaviors and had then data for 144 locations. And the result was very clear, so we could exclude this hypothesis. Now, when you live in a stable environment, then you're more innovative. So this is the opposite here. If you live in a more variable environment, you have a higher occurrence probability of the behaviors. This is the strongest effect was for the distance to the refugia, but it also occurred for the precipitation, although it was a much weaker effect, and the savanna forest difference. So very clear now, the behavioral diversity is higher in more variable environments. That's the first thing we can learn from that. Now back to our overview here, and now let's take some other data, because what we've seen with that model of chimpanzee distribution over 125,000 years, the populations are expanding and contracting, and that must do something also to the genetics of the population. So let's look at genetic diversity. And genetic diversity not in the sense of there's some gene-culture co-evolution, but it's as a measure of population size. And the question here is chimpanzee behavioral diversity higher in larger, it's higher in larger populations, so is it positively related to heterozygosity? So the idea here is that larger populations, or populations with a larger effective population size, so in the past, that they have a higher heterozygosity. They are more variable, they are more diverse. Or is it the opposite? So when does the behavioral diversity emerge? So again, we used the same approach, but I mean, for that we needed a large number of genetic data. So 800 individuals were sequenced, there were more, but we considered this enough to do this study. Chromosome 21, and then also microsatellites. And you see here on the map, this is quite variable. In West Africa, genetic diversity is very low. Yeah, Western Equatorial Africa, it is higher, and then it's intermediate in East Africa. As before, we related the heterozygosity, so this genetic diversity, to the 31 behaviors we had at these 144 locations. And results were again quite clear. This is what you see here in this plot. So with the estimate for the genetic diversity was negative. We had expected the opposite, because you could think if you have a large population, you have more individuals that can invent something. But this is not what we observe here. We observe that smaller populations have this higher behavioral diversity, and this is a bit puzzling. It indicates that there must be some adaptive value in these smaller populations that live in these challenging environments. There is some pressure to be flexible and to be innovative. So I could now continue here with more studies and talking about that, but I want to slowly now transition also from that scheme I've shown to you, studying great apes for understanding hominid evolution, to contributing to conservation science with another study. And back here to overview of spatial layers. I've talked now about the behavioral diversity, genetic diversity, to some extent the habitat diversity, and then the landscape history. And there's one important factor we have to look at now in the context of behavioral diversity, and this is the human impact. So what does the human impact do to the behavioral diversity of our closest living relatives? You see already here some of the threats, and I will come to that in a moment. And a colleague wrote this piece here, The Cultured Chimpanzee. It was an article on the Pan-African program. And as a subtitle, she chose, do chimpanzees have traditions? This is the question we are pursuing. As wild populations dwindle, researchers are racing to find out. Yeah? That is the thing we are facing. And we can now ask, what are the consequences of the human footprint? And the human footprint is an index measure. It's a measure of several variables, including human population growth, deforestation, infrastructure, and so on. It is widely used to measure impact of human activities on the planet, on biodiversity. And this is also what we did. And what we found, this was really, really shocking. There was a massive decline in behavioral diversity in chimpanzees in areas with lowest human impact to areas with highest human impact. It was almost 90%. And so the question is, why is this happening? It is not because populations are gone. I mean, this is then too trivial. I mean, once they are gone, also apparently their culture is gone. This is not what we mean here. But what is meant here is the populations are still there. Maybe they declined to some extent, but they have lost their behaviors. And this is either because the resources are gone, because also humans use the forest or the habitat they use, or it is because they are disturbed and they cannot practice the behavior anymore. And it can sometimes happen in science. You start with something and then you realize it has really relevance for real-world applications. And this was also the case with that study. People try now to integrate behavioral diversity into conservation. And then the study was published. And there's now the suggestion to create chimpanzee cultural heritage sites. So that is not enough to have a protected area, because we also observe decline in protected areas, and I come to that later. So while I'm saying this, I play here this video. The idea is to create these sites where resources are protected, where it is ensured that they can practice their behavior to make sure that these behaviors are protected also for the future. Okay, and so this brings me now to the second part of my lecture, where I want to talk more about conservation science. When humans moved out of Africa and they arrived on the different continents, there was a pattern that was repeated every time, whether it was in Europe or whether it was in North America or Asia. It was the megafauna, so the very large animals, mammals, they went extinct. And this also happened to some extent in Africa, but we have the largest megafauna communities still left in Africa. The great apes nowadays are distributed in tropical Africa and Southeast Asia, on the islands of Sumatra and Borneo. And the orangutans were once distributed also on the mainland up to China, but they are extinct since several thousand years, also because of human impact. In Africa, we have 9 taxa of great apes, the bonobo, 4 subspecies of chimpanzees, 2 species and 4 subspecies of gorillas. And then for the orangutans, we have 4 taxa in total. So what is now the problem? What are the threats to great apes? This is a picture I have taken when flying across Democratic Republic of Congo. It was from Kinshasa to eastern Congo. And this is something that has happened many, many times in that place, but also in other countries. You see a forest landscape. And you see at the horizon, you see higher canopy forest, which is in the left part of the image. And in the other part, the canopy is already much lower. So you see a road with villages and houses along. And people have created their plantations next to the houses, next to the road. And this is how a landscape is changing when humans move into that. And this also has happened for sure here in Europe a long time ago. Slash and burn agriculture is practiced. And in many places, there is also civil unrest, which makes conservation efforts also more challenging and difficult. This is a picture from Liberia. Here in Tsavo National Park in Liberia, a poacher camp is burned down, where hunters smoke meat to sell then later on the market. This is now moving forward. I don't know why. Oops. What is happening here? As a byproduct of hunting apes, orphans are sold either nationally or internationally. Sorry, I don't know what is happening here. And the orphans, they are sometimes sold to zoos, to the large number of zoos in the Middle East and also in Southeast Asia, sometimes for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Timber is extracted, and is obviously changing the forest structure. And there are big mines. Tropical Africa is very, very rich in mineral resources. I had mentioned this before, where I said also we are contributing. So maybe I need to stop this for a moment. I don't know what is happening here. Okay, sorry for that. Okay, back to this here. This, in the smaller picture, you see a bauxite mine in Guinea. Guinea has the world's largest deposit on bauxite. This is used for aluminium production. And also, we in Germany import aluminium from Guinea. So we use it, for instance, for the production of cars. So we have also some responsibility, we can say remote responsibility, for what is happening there. Obviously, there are no easy solutions for that, but it is one of the threats. And then last, it is about agriculture. Examples here are cacao or coffee. We are importing, for instance, from Ivory Coast in West Africa. And for these plantations, forest is cut down, and with that also the habitat of great apes is lost. So now what does this do to the conservation status of great apes? It's now about 20 years ago that it was clear that if we want to inform conservation bodies, also, for instance, IUCN Red List, we need a central archive for great ape population data that was not available at the time. So we created this IUCN Apes database, which hosts now all the field survey data for great apes, millions and millions of records. And for a long time, people have done that. I also did this. This is counting these objects. And you may think, what is that? Why, how the hell can you count great apes with that? So this is a sleeping nest of a chimpanzee. And when you go to a rainforest, I mean, you hear all these sounds, but you rarely see animals. Because animals, they run away if they are hunted. But it's also because the forest is so dense. But great apes, they build nests, with the exceptions of the very large silverbacks, which often sleep on the ground. So they go up high in the canopy. It can be 30 or even 40 meters. They sleep there. They build these platforms. They break branches. These nests, they get dry, and they can remain for weeks and months and even years in the forest. So in the end, these nests are much, much more numerous than the apes, so you can count them in a much, much easier way. And then you have to convert them into a number of apes. This is how it was done in the past. So here we are doing some transect work in Equatorial Guinea in the rainforest. Nowadays, this is moving to other methods, digital methods like camera trapping. And the advantage of that is you do not only get apes, but you also get many other species, which were very difficult to count before. And you have seen here on that video, or you see it now, that you can, with some AI methods, you can extract information from these videos. For instance, how many individuals are in there. The advantage of that is also, I mean, the methods we develop for great apes, they are also usable for many other species, also here in Germany. Whether it's wolves or other species, very useful methods. But now coming back to the great apes, we have now in the database a lot of data, very good data. And you see it's quite a distribution. Not everything is covered because they're not surveyed everywhere, but it's already enough to do good spatial models, to do good analysis, and also to come up with abundances. So by now, we have a good idea of how many apes there are left. Of these 14 taxa I've mentioned before, 9 in Africa, and then these 5 in Southeast Asia. But you see that there's quite a big difference. When the smallest population, the cross-river gorillas, they have just 300 individuals left. You could say now 300 population is okay, but they are highly fragmented. Sometimes you have maybe 9 individuals in one group, but then maybe 15 or 25. So very, very fragmented, very problematic. On the other hand, you have the western lowland gorilla with almost 400,000 individuals. And you may think, oh, what's the problem here? I mean, they're so numerous, but I'll come to that. And then all the other species and subspecies, they are somewhere in between. Okay. In total, there are between 700 and 900,000 individuals remaining. It sounds a lot, but now I tell you what the problem is. For the IUCN Red List, the total abundance is just one factor. The IUCN Red List lists the conservation status of a quite large number of species, tens of thousands of species. What is more important than the total abundance is the rate of change. And when the rate of change exceeds, for instance, 80% in 3 generations, a species is classified as critically endangered. And this is what has happened now for most of the ape taxa. With the Apes database, we could come up with these estimates here of the rate of change. And what you see here is for most of the taxa, the bars are red. On the left side, there's a decline. And there's just one for which it is green. It is the mountain gorilla. So they are now, with a bit more than 1,000 individuals, they're increasing from 200 to 250 individuals 40 years ago. But now you have other populations with almost 400,000. They are listed as critically endangered because of their massive decline. Now you could also think, okay, if you have a 2% decline per year, it doesn't sound a lot. But now if you project it over 10 or 20 years, half of your population is gone. And that is the problem. So now what to do? So I could stop here and leave you frustrated and you say, I should have done something else today, but I will not do that. So what works in conservation and what does not work? This is obviously one of the most important questions. And this is also where conservation scientists can make a very, very important contribution. But we have to state that for the primates, there's a severe lack of evidence for the conservation of primates. This is for great apes, but also for other primate species. You see in this plot here, upper right, you see this long blue bar that indicates the number of studies for birds. Yes, there are more species in birds, 11,000 compared to roughly 700 in primates. But now the smallest blue bar indicates 80 studies. So for all primates, there are 80 scientific studies looking at the effectiveness of conservation. When we think about evidence-based medicine about a particular topic, we would think that maybe a few hundred, or even thousands of articles are just about enough to understand of what is working, what's not working. Now, in evidence-based conservation, we are only at the start of that. So it's a very, very open field, and a lot of work is needed. Now, in a phylogenetic context, here the hominidae with the great apes, they have the largest number of studies, 25 in total. So we talk about 25 studies on the conservation effectiveness of great apes. And I think no one would say we know everything. A lot of work is needed. But now, how do we approach that? And I want to give you some insights into this. This year, a first attempt listing some of the conservation interventions. So for sure, I'm not going through all of them to bore you here, but I want to just highlight the first two. Protected areas are obviously very important. And what we did here is we asked experts in the field to rate all of these interventions as either highly effective, semi-effective, or not effective. And with protected areas, you see the blue category was not even chosen. So about 3/4 were quite satisfied with how protected areas work, but not all. It was almost the same for the researchers, but researchers not in the way you may think of, contributing scientific evidence, but it's in another way, and I will come back to that later. So, but first now to the protected area effectiveness. So this is a study looking at the protected area effectiveness, not only in ape habitat, but also in other parts of Africa and also in Europe. And this is very important to also look over a larger context, because it's easy to point now with a finger somewhere else and say this is not working, but then when you look at another region, you may have the same problem. And in that study, experts, conservation managers, park managers were interviewed, and reports were studied, monitoring data, and so on. And what came out was it focused on mammals, not just great apes, but mammals in general, more than 400 species, and birds. And what we see here is it's over a 10-year period. We have a decline in the mammal abundance in Europe by about 10%. That's something maybe we would not have thought. In Africa, in all these protected areas, it was 30%. Yes, it is more, but by far it's not perfect here. With the birds, the difference was not as big. 15% Europe, 25% in Africa. Now, when we look at the feeding gills, you see, I'm not going here into detail, but you see there is no group where you do not have a decline. This is what we can learn from that. So now the question is, what is ongoing? And so the first thing what we can learn is when we look at the threats, so I've shown to you some of the threats, there are more involved here. You have the gray points indicating data points from Africa, and then in black, the one from Europe. So the first thing we learn here, it's plotted over the Human Development Index, which is a measure of the socioeconomic context. And first you see there is a continuum. The variation within Africa is larger than, for instance, the variation between Africa and Europe. And there's a continuous decline, but it's not going down to zero. So the threat is at a relatively high level also here in the European protected areas. And now I thought for a long time, shall I put in this plot here or not? But I'll take now some time to explain it, because it's very important. So it's a 3D plot that has the Human Development Index, so the socioeconomic conditions of all these protected areas, so 114 in total. and it's the level of threat. So you can now look at all of these conditions. You have a plane in there, yeah, for the combination of all of them. The black circles indicate the data points above the plane, and the open circles indicate the data points below the plane. Yeah, the plane is not totally flat, and you see variation as a function of threat and human development index. On the z-axis, you have the stability of biodiversity. Now, we would assume that under perfect conditions, so when protected areas are really, really functional, biodiversity should be stable. Should be at 1.0, 100%. But what we see here is that even under the best condition, this is not happening. We have a slight decline, and it's as before. Even if you have a slight decline of only 1% or 2% per year, over the long term, there is a problem. And this is exactly what the data show. So that means coming back to the responses of the experts here, that not everyone said, yes, protected areas are perfect. Yeah, some are good, others are better, but some are also worse. And there is something that needs to be done. Yeah, the protected area itself is not totally functional. And now I would like to come to the researchers, how they make a contribution to the functionality and the effectiveness of protected areas, but in a different way as you may think. So it is not about contributing scientific evidence, but in a very unexpected way. So let's go now to Ivory Coast, Thai National Park. It's West African country, and there's Thai National Park on the border to Liberia. There's a long-term research site existing since the 1970s, and these are some of the pictures. So when I worked there, I met a lot of people studying very different species: eagles, mongooses, various monkey species, birds, and so on. Another picture here. Here we're discussing with the director of the national park of how research can be used as a management intervention. And it is the following. So a study had been conducted around this station, looking at the abundance and the gradient in abundance of various species. What you see in this red square is a bunch of numbers, and all are negative except one. The one that is positive indicates the distance to the research area in relation to the hunting signs. And that means the further away you are from the research site, the more hunting sites you find. But for all others, it's the opposite. So the closer you get to the research site, the higher the abundance of various species. And the abundance is sometimes up to 100 times higher than in other parts of the park. For instance, close to the station, you can find up to 300 monkeys in a single square kilometer. In other places, you do not even find one. Yeah, it's a massive, massive positive effect within a protected area. And this is not because researchers have now figured out something on how to better protect the park. It is only because they were present, and they were present for decades and decades, every day. And you see this here in the map on the distribution of the hunting signs. So around the research area, the density of hunting signs is 0. And in other places, it is much, much higher. Yeah, and that is the very, very positive effect. When you go to the field, now when you study whatever species, you directly contribute to conservation, and it has such a massive effect. It was now replicated in many other studies, also in other parts of the world. So with that, I'm at the end of my presentation, and hopefully now with a positive twist, I would like to encourage also all the students among you, when you are interested in ecology, in field research, or whatever topic, yeah, you will have this very, very positive effect and will directly contribute to conservation of biodiversity. And obviously, this is not work I have done alone. There were hundreds and hundreds of people involved into all of these projects or that supported me over all the years. I would like to thank very much for that. And with that, I'm at the end of my talk here, and I'm now looking very much forward to the discussion and questions from you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for proving you right. now invite questions from the audience.
I said already, if there are no questions, I will ask you. I will ask questions to you.
And if you have a question, please wait till I'm there with the microphone, because there are people online who would not hear otherwise.
We have 2 minutes.
Thank you very much for this very, very interesting talk. So I'm working on policy instruments and governance for biodiversity conservation. And I was wondering, with your last message, the more research stations you have, it's quite a high effectiveness for conservation. But what does it tell us? Should we have more research stations scattered all around the landscape? I mean, what's the consequence of these indicators?
I mean, some have suggested build 1,000 research stations. Yeah, it would help a lot in conservation. But obviously, when you think about the scale, this is an area of about 200 square kilometer. I mean, maybe it's expanding a bit more, so you can maybe think it's 300-400 square kilometer, but it's not tens of thousands of square kilometer. That's obviously one thing. And you've seen this list of interventions. That was just the second one. So there are others that are relevant. Yeah, it can be only one contribution. But I wanted to motivate scientists to go to the field and do their work.
Hjalmar, thank you very much for this truly fascinating talk. It is a pleasure to be here today and learn from you. And when I was listening to your talk, I said, well, why didn't I study biology? And I became a management professor, so something else. And I thought, well, I want to do what you do. But then I was looking into the first part of your talk, and then I realized, well, actually you do something we do in management too, namely understanding the behavior or the diversity of behavior in groups or in populations. So there's some overlap to the field of management, and since we are colleagues, I would like to invite you to one of my management classes because I think that is helpful for people and who do management. At the end of the day, as they say, you know, culture eats strategy, and I think we can learn from you. But I do have a question as well. You were saying that, in my simple words, the presence of humans reduces the diversity, the behavioral diversity of apes, basically. Why is that so? What is the explanation for that, and how is the behavioral diversity reduced? Are chimpanzees and others just becoming lazy, and what would be the explanation for that?
So I think there are mainly two explanations. So the first one is when humans use the same resources as the apes. So think about, there was one video where they cracked nuts. Now when humans also collect nuts, they are no longer available for the apes. So they just cannot practice their behavior anymore. That is one thing. Another thing is nut cracking is noisy. Yeah, it's quite easy to then target apes and to hunt them. And they quickly learn then not to practice this behavior anymore. But I think there's also a third component. This is when I looked into the data of nut production, so of trees, it is clearly linked to climate fluctuations. And now with the weather patterns changing, it could also be that this is one of the issues. So you have, I assume, I mean, this is not like all proven, it's a hypothesis, but so you can think that you have a sensitive time period when you learn. It's like for us, I mean, when we are younger, so we learn certain things much, much faster. But now, if you're not exposed to years with a lot of nuts, it may also influence you whether you will practice it later or not. Like I said, this is a hypothesis, it has not been proven, but we see this enormously variable production in nuts. I think these are the explanations for that. But I would also like to thank you for your invitation. I'm very happy to come. Yeah.
And that is a promise.
Is this working? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. Now, my question is, you encourage us to go out and study these magnificent animals. It's a dream of mine to do this, but it also concerns me where I think about the safety of this job. Now I know, for example, from the head of the Nyaro Menteng facility in Indonesia that there were many hits placed on him by the mafia who wants to combat his conservation work. How safe is this, for example, in the African countries? And is there a threat to us scientists or future scientists who want to practice this?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I mean, first, I think you don't have to study apes. You can also study other species. You will have the same effect. Yeah? I mean, this is just one example. But wherever you are present, you will make a positive contribution, whether it is about birds or whether it's about primates or other species. That's the first thing. And then second, this is what we experienced with the Pan-African program. When I said we started at 57 locations, we could complete the work at 39 locations. At some, because the apes were gone, but others because of security issues. It's an issue. There are countries that are more stable and others that are less stable. And I mean, we see now the world is changing in many, many ways. And it also has an impact on this work. This is very clear. Yeah. I mean, there is no guarantee and no, say, perfect security. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very fascinating, a broad spectrum of things that you shared with us. Thank you. I'm a behavioral scientist myself, studying the humans as they move through the world. So I got interested in one of your findings, and this is a little bit of a nitty-gritty question of a behavioral scientist to another one. Your second finding, where you showed that the smaller populations had a larger variability. And I was wondering whether that could be an artifact and whether you were able to rule that out. Why artifact? It could be a selection effect. So how did they become smaller? Or were they always smaller? Could you rule that out? That's just a factual question that I have. And maybe you say that first. Yes, please.
Yeah, obviously we cannot rule that out. So this is how then science progresses. Okay. So you come up with something, you come up with a study, you investigate that, and you're puzzled because you would expect the opposite. Although it has also been found for humans. I mean, there was competing hypotheses. Some suggest larger populations have a larger cultural repertoire. But in other studies that could not be found. So it is not clear, not even in humans, it's clear. And so I think the same is happening now with the great apes. I mean, this is one proposition, but maybe someone else will find something. But this is how science advances. You have your data, you look into that, you try to do the best analysis, and then in the end you have to see whether this remains stable with replicate studies or not.
No, it's good. You were just very strong in your causal inference. Okay. So that's all I was reacting to. I'm all for, more work is needed.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm the last one to deny that. So my second point is, you may be familiar or maybe not that TU Dresden has become one of the hotspots in data-intensive science and interdisciplinary digital science. And so you were showing to us enormous fortunes of data. And you mentioned one of the platforms where they were uploaded, which seems to be an international platform.
It is,
but also you were mentioning that in your own work you had shown us the variables and, with the camera traps and stuff like that. And so my question is this type of data part of any of the NFDIs in Germany or not at all?
No, not yet. So the problem is, and we are struggling since a while with that, and maybe you can also add something to it. So this is 140 terabyte of data, and it's growing. And the problem to find solution, you think this is little. Maybe for some people it's little, but in biology it's a lot of data. And to transfer this data is already a problem. And so we expect a growth of several, maybe even dozens of terabytes per year. And already handling the data is an issue. And that prevents us then from doing all the very interesting analysis also. But maybe, Carsten, you want to add something to it? No? No.
So the audience just listening via broadcasting is not realizing there's a bit of laughing here. What happened was Hjalmar was mentioning 140 terabyte of data, and then one of the chief persons in digital infrastructures at TU Dresden pointed to me, and I pointed to him. So I cannot say that much. 140 terabyte is not nothing. And what we see here is a general trend that we have in all fields. Biodiversity science is only one exception, is one example where we get masses of data. And yes, NFDIs will help, but at some point, if you come to Senckenberg alone, you talk about petabyte, and it goes on and it goes on. And my final word is, we do not have, and I think it's not only Senckenberg, but I believe that science not yet has the infrastructures that keep on pace with the development of data.
So for me, you have an enormous possibility of new type of interdisciplinarity. Why do I say this? So you are not alone with an explosion of data, amount of data. The opposite is the case. This is a general trend in all the sciences, okay? We were lucky enough to get one of the big research centers for the phasing out of coal money, which you may have heard about, the German Center for Astrophysics, okay? That's another example. They don't know how to deal with the tsunamis of data they get every hour, every day. So there are multiple solutions to this, and we have people here at TU Dresden who actually make this the focus of their work. To just give you one example, if you apply AI in the spot to your camera pictures based on previous knowledge, you can reduce the load of the video feed. It's just one example.
Yeah.
And you could go on and on and on. So I would just encourage, because it is so important. I mean, these data are extremely expensive, monetarily, but also by all the humans who contributed. And it would be such a shame if it wasn't possible to even get wider use of it.
No, these are very good points. And for instance, what you said about reducing the data from the start, putting the AI algorithm into the camera, we are discussing that. And then the point is it better to archive data? I mean, for instance, taking then frames, that you have something for the future, because it's a very valuable archive. It's a digital archive, and maybe something you would not study now, but you would have it in the future, similar like you do it in a physical collection. Yeah. But if you have good context, I'm very happy. Yeah. Very good. Very good.
Just simple, we need to talk. I mean, in terms of data masses, what you said, that is almost nothing what you have. So that is easy.
Very good to hear.
And in terms of the camera traps and the sensor networks that you build, I think also broadcasting technologies would be another issue to discuss, to see whether and how far you can get data directly transferred in the one or other manner. And also there, I think we have a lot of technology on the campus that you could easily use.
Excellent. Very happy.
And let's talk.
To hear, yeah.
We take you by the word. Yes, and then we come with the other 1.5 petabyte, and then we see what you say to the Osiris consortium. But we'll see. Do we have further questions? Yes? Please.
Thank you for the nice lecture, and congratulations for your new post. And I have a question about the behavioral diversity. Continue with the previous question. The behavioral diversity in the larger group was smaller than the smaller group. That's what I understood. And could that be because there is any social pressure, or the individuals in the larger group are standardized in their age, background, and all the other behind stories?
So first, the behavioral diversity was higher in the smaller populations. And these are factors we have to include now step by step. I mean, that was the point. What I try to make is, I mean, you start with something, you come up with a result, it seems to be stable, but then you have to look for explanations. And certainly the social component is another aspect that is very important. Next to landscape history, you have the genetics, or the population history. You have to look into the social and demographic factors. The data are available from that program, and that's a very logical next step to do. I don't have an answer now, but it's a very logical next step to include.
Well, I have a hypothesis from my experience. I was a soldier, and I used to work as a military consultant. So my army unit was 400 people, and there's one day, there was some kind of music festival for the soldiers, and then 4 members of another family was invited. So that time we were given a drink, and what all soldiers were doing was sitting down, looking straight, and just drink the juice, which was standardized. That was the programmed behavior. But when I saw the 4 members of the family, they were all behaving, walking around, just drinking or throwing away. There was more diversity in the smaller group for behavior. And could that be also applied for the great ape case as well?
I mean, it's a good example of about the dynamics of groups or populations, how different they can be. Yeah? I think we cannot transfer that one-to-one. That's certainly not possible. I mean, they live in social groups. It's not that you have a group of 400 individuals, yeah? But they live in distinct social groups. And it's more, everything is happening on that social group level, or maybe also with transfer of individuals among groups. So certainly not one-to-one, but what you described, I think, is an excellent example of how dynamics can change and how these dynamics can lead to different outcome. That this is very important, so that you can observe this higher diversity in a smaller group than in this larger group. No.
And have you done that research before?
No, I haven't. No.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I have to ask another question. Are similar studies being done for the other great apes, like the gorillas and the bonobos? And if yes, is there something interesting observed, like in the chimpanzees?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Also, very good question. So for the bonobos, a similar program has started this year. This is now ongoing at 5 sites, and it will continue for much longer at other sites to come to a similar number and data set. The bonobos are endemic to the Democratic Republic of Congo, and it's very challenging to work there. So it's much more difficult than for the chimpanzees. It will take certainly much longer. And for the bonobos, it is not yet clear because they are studied only at very few sites. So we have a very limited understanding. Now, for the gorillas, they are generally not considered as diverse as the chimpanzees or the bonobos. And then for the orangutans, yes, there are a lot of studies ongoing.
So the standard academic 90 minutes are almost over. Does anybody dare to ask one more question?
I think it's time for.
So audience says we should check if the caterer did its job. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much for being with us, be this in this audience or from afar. Thanks for asking questions, and far and foremost, Hjalmar, thanks for your presentation.
Yeah.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So what I said about the caterer was